On the morning of November 18, 1883, thousands of railroad employees across the United States and Canada did something that felt strangely unnatural. They adjusted their clocks. In small stations and major terminals, station agents opened glass cases and turned minute hands forward or back. Conductors checked pocket watches that no longer matched the town square. Dispatchers rewrote chalkboard schedules they had memorized by heart. For years, they had lived with the quiet chaos of local time, each town keeping its own noon, its own authority over the sun. It had mostly worked, until it didn't. Railroads do not tolerate ambiguity well. A train leaving at 12,005 cannot safely meet another leaving at 12,007 if those minutes mean different things in different places. Connections were missed, accidents were narrowly avoided. Passengers blamed clerks who had done nothing wrong. Freight piled up because time itself refused to align. So on that Sunday, without a vote, without a law, and without ceremony, railroads imposed order. 4 time zones replaced thousands of local ones. At a precise moment, clocks across a continent snapped into agreement. Noon became a rule rather than a feeling. The sun no longer decided when the day turned. Steel schedules did. Most people barely noticed. Church services ran slightly early or late. Lunch came at an unfamiliar hour. Newspapers mentioned the change in passing. There were no parades, no speeches, no sense that anything important had happened. But something had. A system had quietly asserted itself. From that day forward, time would belong less to place and more to coordination. Life would organize around schedules rather than seasons. Decisions made in distant offices would assume that everywhere now agreed on what now meant. This is the way rail began to work. Not by drawing attention, not by asking permission, but by solving a practical problem so completely that the solution becomes invisible. Railroads did not set out to standardize time. They needed trains to avoid crashing into each other. But once steel demanded agreement, the country adapted, commerce adapted, labor adapted, daily routines adapted, the system remained. That moment did not feel like nation building, it felt like maintenance. And that is the pattern. Rail does not announce its influence, it embeds it. It turns choices into structures and structures into assumptions until entire economies are organized around decisions no one remembers making. The rail lines that built nations rarely did so through spectacle. They did it by making certain ways of living possible and others impractical. To understand how that happened, you have to start before rail existed at all. Before railroads, distance was not an inconvenience. It was a risk. Moving goods across land meant committing to uncertainty. Wagons carried limited weight. Roads were often little more than packed dirt, passable one week and impassable the next. Rain turned routes into mud. Dry weather turned them into dust. Animals needed rest, food, and care, and their failure could end a journey entirely. A few hundred miles could take weeks, sometimes longer, sometimes never. For people who made their living moving goods, distance imposed discipline. You learned quickly what could survive travel and what could not. You learned what markets were worth reaching and which ones were not. You learned how much loss to expect and how much delay you could afford. Most producers stayed close to home because they had to. Farmers grew what could be consumed nearby or preserved without spoilage. Heavy materials were used where they were extracted. Manufacturing clustered tightly around overlapping sources of input and demand. Economic ambition was bounded by geography, not by imagination. Water softened these limits, but only selectively. Rivers and canals allowed larger volumes to move with less effort. A barge could carry what dozens of wagons could not. Towns with navigable water prospered. Ports became gateways. Inland regions without reliable access developed slowly, if at all. Even then, time remained unreliable. Rivers froze. Floods disrupted schedules. Droughts stranded cargo. A shipment might arrive quickly, or it might not arrive at all. Planning beyond the near future was an exercise in optimism rather than strategy. Markets reflected that reality. Prices varied widely from place to place. A surplus in one region did little to relieve shortage in another. Trade existed, but it was fragmented, local, and shaped by what geography allowed rather than what demand required. Political authority followed similar lines. Regions oriented themselves toward nearby markets and ports rather than distant capitals. National economies existed more on paper than in practice. A country could claim territory it could not reliably integrate. Distance ruled, not as an abstract measurement, but as a force that decided what was worth attempting and what was not. Railroads emerged into this world not as an incremental improvement, but as a rupture. For the first time, it became possible to move large volumes of goods across land on schedules that could be trusted, not quickly by modern standards, but predictably. The land could be crossed deliberately rather than endured. This did not eliminate distance, it reorganized it. Once a shipment could be expected to arrive within a defined window, production no longer had to sit next to consumption. Goods could be made where conditions were favorable and shipped where demand existed. Specialization became viable at a scale that had not been practical before. But this shift was not evenly distributed. Railroads did not blanket territories uniformly. They followed routes chosen under pressure. Pressure from investors seeking return, from engineers navigating terrain, from governments balancing cost, politics, and urgency. Those routes determined who gained access to emerging national markets and who remained peripheral. A place did not need to move to be left behind. The land stayed where it was. The meaning of its location changed. Regions that had once thrived because of water access found themselves bypassed. Inland areas that had been marginal suddenly became central. Growth accelerated along corridors while slowing elsewhere. What rail offered was not fairness. It offered consistency. Consistency in time. Consistency in cost. Consistency in capacity. That consistency allowed economic behavior to stabilize across larger areas. Prices converged, supply chains lengthened, planning horizons expanded. Rail reduced the tyranny of distance without conquering it. Instead, it bound distance to steel paths that would become economic spines. Those spines did more than move goods. They defined where opportunity could take root. And once those roots formed, they were difficult to dislodge. Railroads look like transportation projects. In practice, they are commitments. When a rail line is proposed, it is usually justified by something immediate. A coal seam that needs access to market, grain that must move more cheaply, a port that wants inland reach. Engineers survey terrain, investors calculate returns, governments weigh cost against urgency. The logic is practical. The consequences are permanent. Once steel is laid, it is rarely moved. The expense of relocation is enormous. The disruption is unacceptable. What begins as a response to present demand hardens into a fixed feature of the landscape. Rail resists revision. Roads can be widened. Routes can shift. Truck paths change with fuel prices and congestion. Air routes are reconfigured seasonally. Rail does not behave this way. Tracks embedded in soil insist on continuity. That resistance is not a flaw. It is the source of rail's power. A rail line signals confidence. It tells investors that movement will remain stable for decades. It tells industries that access will persist. It tells towns that connection is not temporary. People build accordingly. Factories are sited next to tracks because moving heavy inputs becomes predictable and affordable. Grain elevators appear because bulk transport now makes sense. Mines expand because output can reach distant markets without eroding margins. These decisions stack. A warehouse attracts roads. Roads attract workers. Workers need housing. Housing brings services, schools, and political attention. What began as a line drawn on a map becomes an ecosystem that assumes the rail will always be there. Removing it now would not just disrupt transport, it would unravel everything that formed around it. Over time, this is how rail began to create economic gravity. It does not pull activity evenly, it concentrates it. Certain places become disproportionately valuable, while others drift toward the margins. Over time, this concentration begins to feel natural, even inevitable. Cities appear destined to exist where they do. Industrial regions feel like the obvious outcome of geography. But many of these patterns trace directly to rail alignments chosen under very specific conditions. Routes laid to serve 19th century coal seams or agricultural basins continue to shape 21st century economies. Rail locks an advantage. Once a region gains access, it becomes easier to attract capital, easier to retain labor, easier to justify additional infrastructure. New lines connect to existing hubs, reinforcing their centrality. Regions bypassed by rail face a different path. They may survive through local markets or alternative transport, but competing at scale becomes difficult. Over time, economic activity drifts toward connected corridors. The gaps widen rather than close. This outcome is rarely deliberate. Railroads were built to solve immediate problems: move goods cheaply, reach new markets, serve rising demand. The redistribution of opportunity that followed was a side effect. But once established, it became self-reinforcing. Rail did not just move goods between places, it decided which places mattered. That decision persists because rail is slow to change and expensive to abandon. Even as industries decline or trade patterns shift, the physical network remains, guiding new activity along old paths. Modern economies still follow these lines. Industrial clusters align with historic rail corridors. Logistics hubs sit where multiple lines intersect. Ports remain relevant because rail delivers inland access. Regions without that access rely more heavily on roads, often at higher cost and lower efficiency. The future, in many cases, continues to move along tracks laid generations ago. This is why rail cannot be understood as neutral infrastructure. It encodes priorities. It reflects who had capital, who had influence, and who was considered worth connecting at the moment decisions were made. Once translated into steel, those judgments outlive their context. Rail lines do not argue, they remain. And by remaining, they continue to shape how nations grow, where wealth accumulates, and which regions stay tied into the economic core. The map of a country's rail network is not just a record of movement. It is a record of commitment, fixed in place. For decades, railroads in the American South existed side by side without fully belonging to the same system. Tracks connected towns, trains moved goods, commerce flowed. But beneath the appearance of integration, the region remained fragmented by a detail that seemed technical and unimportant. The rails were the wrong distance apart. Southern lines had been built using a 5-foot gauge. Much of the rest of the country used a narrower standard. The difference was small, but its consequences were enormous. Freight cars could not move freely across regions. Cargo had to be unloaded and reloaded. Time was lost. Costs rose. Efficiency stalled at the border between systems. The South was connected, but not interoperable. By the 1880s, that limitation had become a problem the region could no longer afford. National markets were consolidating. Scale mattered. Fragmentation meant falling behind. So, a decision was made. In May of 1886, Southern railroads coordinated a transformation that would normally take years. Instead, they compressed it into a single weekend. Crews were dispatched across thousands of miles of track. Section hands, foremen, and supervisors worked from detailed plans, each responsible for a narrow segment of the system. The instructions were simple and unforgiving. Move one rail inward. Adjust the ties. Reset the gauge. Everything had to happen on schedule. If a section ran late, it would break the chain. If coordination failed, rolling stock would be stranded. If the work was sloppy, derailments would follow. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was an all-or-nothing conversion. For 2 days, rail service slowed or stopped entirely. Crews worked in heat and rain. Tools rang against steel. Timetables were suspended. The region held its breath. By Monday morning, the rails aligned. Freight cars that had once stopped at the edge of the system now rolled through without interruption. Goods moved farther, faster, and more cheaply. The South did not announce its entry into a national rail network. It simply began operating as part of one. This moment rarely appears in popular history. There was no golden spike, no photograph that captured the significance. Newspapers treated it as an engineering success, not a political transformation. But that weekend rewired the region's economy. Interoperability did what expansion alone could not. It turned a patchwork of local lines into a coherent system. Markets that had once been separated by friction now responded to shared prices. Producers gained access to distant demand. Shippers planned beyond regional boundaries. The South did not just gain efficiency, it gained participation. Once the rails agreed on distance, the economy followed. This is part of the quiet logic of infrastructure. Alignment matters more than ambition. Compatibility matters more than speed. A system does not become national when it grows large. It becomes national when it works together. And once that cooperation is embedded in steel, it becomes difficult to undo. Railroads did not spread across continents on diagrams and balance sheets alone. They were built by bodies, hands swinging hammers, backs carrying steel, men working at the edge of exhaustion because the system demanded speed, precision, and endurance long before it offered protection or recognition. Nowhere was that more visible than in the western mountains, where rail met terrain that refused to cooperate. When the Central Pacific Railroad pushed eastward through the Sierra Nevada in the 1860s, the problem was not distance, it was rock, granite ridges that could not be bypassed, snow that buried work sites for months, slopes that turned mistakes into fatalities. To solve it, the railroad relied heavily on Chinese laborers. By the height of construction, they made up the majority of the workforce, tens of thousands over the course of the project, recruited because they were available, disciplined, and willing to work under conditions others would not accept. They blasted tunnels by hand. They hung in baskets over cliffs to place explosives. They shoveled snow faster than it could fall. Avalanches killed without warning. Explosions misfired. Rock slides erased crews in seconds. Deaths were common enough that they stopped being counted precisely. The work required skill. It required coordination. It required experience. It also required invisibility. When the rails finally met at Promontory Summit, photographs captured executives, officials, and ceremonial hammers. The men who had carved the path through the mountains were largely absent. Their labor was treated as interchangeable, their names rarely recorded. This pattern was not unique. Across the rail network, labor existed inside the system rather than alongside it. Track maintenance crews lived by schedules they did not control. Brakemen worked jobs that demanded constant attention and punished mistakes with injury or death. Telegraph operators carried responsibility that far outweighed their pay. Rail required discipline from the people inside it because failure propagated quickly. A missed signal was not a personal error. It was a systemic threat. Workers absorbed that pressure daily. When rail schedules slipped, labor was blamed. When accidents occurred, individuals were faulted even when conditions made mistakes inevitable. The system demanded reliability, but it delivered risk unevenly. This imbalance eventually surfaced. In 1877, wage cuts triggered what became the Great Railroad Strike. It began with railroad workers and spread rapidly across cities and states. Trains stopped, yards filled with idle cars, telegraph lines carried news faster than authorities could respond. The country reacted with panic, not because sympathy was widespread, but because dependence had become visible. When rail stopped, commerce froze, food shipments stalled, coal deliveries halted. Cities felt the disruption within days. The workers were framed as the problem. In reality, they had revealed one. Rail had become so central that it could not fail quietly. The strike exposed how deeply national life depended on coordinated movement and how fragile that coordination was when labor bore all the strain. The response was force. Troops were deployed. Violence followed. The system restarted, but nothing fundamental changed. Rail continued to rely on labor that absorbed risk without sharing control. This is an uncomfortable truth of large infrastructure. The backbone holds because someone carries the weight. Rail did not just reshape geography and markets, it reshaped lives. It dictated where people worked, how long they worked, and how replaceable they were considered. Entire communities formed around yards, shops, and depots, bound to schedules that governed sleep, family life, and survival. The system did not need workers to feel invested. It needed them to be reliable. This tension never fully resolved. It evolved. Labor became more organized. Regulation emerged slowly. Safety improved unevenly. But the core dynamic remained. Rail demanded alignment and punished deviation. Those closest to the steel felt that first. Understanding rail as an invisible backbone requires acknowledging this cost. Not as tragedy for its own sake, not as moral indictment, but as structure. The system that made national scale possible did so by concentrating risk where it was easiest to ignore. Steel did not move itself, people moved it, and the shape of their lives became part of the infrastructure the rest of the country depended on without seeing. Most infrastructure is invisible when it works. Rail is no exception. On ordinary days, trains move without drawing attention. Freight departs terminals on schedule. Yards hum quietly. Goods arrive where they are expected. The system does not announce itself because it does not need to. Its success is measured by absence. No delays, no shortages, no questions. When rail fails, that invisibility collapses. The first signs are subtle. Cars begin to back up at crossings. Yards fill faster than they clear. Schedules slip by hours, then days. Warehouses adjust. Trucks idle, waiting for loads that have not arrived. Then the effects spread. Coal deliveries miss windows. Power plants draw down reserves. Grain sits in elevators instead of moving to ports. Factories slow production because inputs are late. Construction sites wait for steel that exists but cannot reach them. The problem is not scarcity, it is interruption. Rail concentrates movement so efficiently that disruption carries weight far beyond the point of failure. A blocked corridor does not stay local. It ripples outward, pulling time and capacity from the rest of the network. This dynamic became impossible to ignore in moments of national stress. During the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the stoppage was not just a labor dispute, it was a systems failure. Cities that depended on rail for food, fuel, and materials felt the impact almost immediately. Markets tightened, prices shifted, anxiety followed. The public response was not curiosity, it was fear. Rail had become essential infrastructure without ever being named as such. When it stopped, the country realized how thoroughly daily life had been built around it. That realization has repeated itself in quieter forms ever since. Derailments draw attention not because they are common, but because they are disruptive. Strikes provoke outsized reaction, not because they halt everything, but because they threaten to. Weather events become national news when they block key corridors. Each incident briefly reveals the same truth. Rail does not dominate the economy by being fast or visible, it dominates by being load-bearing. Because rail systems operate close to capacity, they absorb normal stress quietly. Schedules flex, routes adjust, delays are managed internally. Most disruptions never reach public awareness because the system compensates. That compensation is deliberate. Idle rail is expensive. Excess capacity represents sunk cost without return. Efficiency requires utilization. Utilization narrows margin. The result is a system that performs exceptionally well under expected conditions and strains under convergence. Weather, labor disputes, equipment failure, and demand spikes test its limits. When those limits are reached, the effects appear suddenly. Rail does not fail dramatically most of the time. It bottlenecks. And bottlenecks reveal dependency. Governments respond accordingly. Rail disruptions have repeatedly triggered intervention. Not because policymakers love railroads, but because the alternative is systemic paralysis. When freight cannot move, the economy does not adapt gracefully. It stutters. The cycle repeats. Normal operation fades from attention. Failure exposes reliance. Intervention stabilizes the system. Invisibility returns. This is one of the paradoxes of rail as an invisible backbone. Its influence is greatest when it is least noticed. Rail networks do not stay fragmented for long. They consolidate. This is not ideological, it is mechanical. Once tracks exist, control over them matters more than ownership of anything that moves across them. A rail line is not just steel, it is access. Whoever controls the corridor controls scheduling, pricing leverage, and priority. Early rail systems were messy. Multiple companies built overlapping lines. Parallel tracks competed for the same freight. Towns were served by rival operators, each setting rates and timetables independently. Some redundancy improved resilience. Much of it was inefficient. Over time, economics resolved the conflict. Larger networks could balance traffic across regions. They could route around disruptions. They could invest in maintenance and signaling at scale. Smaller operators struggled to compete. Absorption followed. Mergers replaced rivalry. Control concentrated. To the public, little seemed to change. Trains still ran, stations still opened, freight still moved, the steel remained in place. What changed was governance. Fewer entities began making decisions that affected vast territories. Scheduling choices in one office-shaped outcomes, hundreds of miles away. Investment decisions determined which corridors received upgrades and which were left to degrade slowly. Rail stopped behaving like a collection of local utilities. It became a continental system. This shift altered the nature of power embedded in rail. Rail operators do not decide which industries exist, they influence which ones are viable. Rates determine whether certain goods can compete. Access determines where facilities are built. Timing determines whether supply chains remain stable. These decisions rarely appear in public debate. They are embedded in tariffs, contracts, and operational rules that look technical and neutral. Yet they shape economic outcomes continuously. Consolidation also changed rail's relationship with the state. Rail became critical infrastructure without becoming public infrastructure. Governments regulated safety and competition while relying on private operators to keep the system functioning. The balance was never comfortable. Rail needed autonomy to optimize routes and costs. The state needed leverage to prevent abuse of position. That tension produced regulation that was procedural rather than transformative. The system remained centralized. This arrangement granted rail a particular kind of power, not command, constraint. By setting the terms under which movement occurred, rail shaped what could happen economically. Shippers, without alternatives, accepted rates they could not negotiate. Towns, with only one rail connection, adjusted their expectations accordingly. Choice existed unevenly. In regions with multiple lines, competition moderated behavior. In regions served by a single corridor, the relationship felt different. Rail was not a partner, it was a condition. This dynamic persists. Modern freight rail networks are smaller in number but larger in scope. Decisions made in corporate offices affect farmers, manufacturers, exporters, and consumers who may never see a train directly. The system works because it is predictable. That predictability depends on centralized control. Rail's influence is therefore not democratic in the everyday sense. It does not respond to immediate feedback. It does not adjust quickly to local pressure. It shapes outcomes by defining boundaries rather than issuing instructions. This kind of power is easy to miss. It does not announce itself. It does not advertise. It does not persuade. It operates. People experience its effects indirectly. A plant closes because shipping costs changed. A region stagnates because access narrowed. A facility is built elsewhere because routing favors another corridor. The tracks do not explain these outcomes. They simply persist. And because they persist, they continue to shape economic geography long after the circumstances that justified them have passed. This is not efficiency. It is inertia with consequence. Once control concentrates, the system becomes harder to challenge and harder to replace. Alternatives are expensive. Duplication is discouraged. The existing network gains durability simply by existing. Rail does not need to defend its position. It inherits it. That inheritance is what allows rail lines to continue building nations long after the era of construction ends. Quietly, administratively, without asking to be noticed. Not everyone who worked the rail system built it with hammers. Some carried it. Pullman porters worked the sleeping cars that moved across the country night after night. They made beds, polished shoes, lifted bags, answered bells. They were expected to be present and invisible at the same time. The job demanded constant availability. Porters worked long hours with little control over schedules. They paid for their own meals and uniforms. Wages were low enough that tips were not a bonus but a necessity. Advancement was limited. Retaliation for complaint was common. And yet the job mattered. For many black men in the early 20th century, becoming a Pullman porter offered rare access to steady employment that crossed regional boundaries. The rail car became a workplace that moved through the nation rather than being fixed to one town. That movement mattered. Porters traveled through cities and rural stops others never saw. They heard conversations from passengers who assumed they were not listening. They read newspapers banned in the South. They learned which cities were hiring, which neighborhoods were safer, which industries were expanding. Information moved with them, quietly. As trains crossed state lines, porters carried more than luggage. They carried news, job leads, and political awareness between communities that were otherwise isolated. In an era of segregation and limited mobility, rail cars became informal corridors of connection. This was not accidental. Porters learned to operate inside the system's blind spots. They followed rules publicly and organized privately. They built networks in motion, using the very predictability of rail schedules to coordinate. In 1925, they began organizing openly under the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. It took 12 years to win recognition. 12 years of surveillance, firings, intimidation, and delay. The company controlled wages, schedules, and housing in some cases. Organizing meant risking everything for a chance at stability. In 1937, they succeeded. The contract raised wages, standardized hours, established overtime rules. It did not overturn the system. It carved space within it. That distinction matters. The Porters did not dismantle rail's hierarchy. They learned how to negotiate inside it. They used its predictability against it. They turned fixed routes into channels for collective action. The impact extended beyond the job. Porters became trusted figures in black communities across the country. Their work connected northern cities to southern towns during the Great Migration. They shared information about opportunities and risks. They helped families decide where to go and how to survive once they arrived. Rail made this possible by accident. The system needed service workers who moved constantly and reliably. It did not anticipate what those workers would carry with them. This is one of the ways rail helped build nations. Not through formal authority, not through infrastructure investment, but through the unintended consequences of movement. The same schedules that disciplined labor also enabled connection. The same corridors that centralized control also distributed knowledge. People adapted. They learned to live within constraints rather than waiting for them to disappear. They found leverage not by stopping the system, but by understanding it deeply. This story complicates the idea of rail as a one-directional force. Rail imposed structure. People found agency inside it. The backbone did not bend easily, but it was not entirely rigid. And the changes that occurred did not come from spectacle or collapse. They came from endurance, coordination, and patience. For people who understood that when a system does not listen, sometimes the only option is to move quietly through it until it has to. Rail systems rarely collapse. They thin. Lines that once carried steady traffic lose relevance as industries change. A branch built to serve a single mine or mill sees volume drop when that operation closes. Passenger service disappears first. Freight follows more slowly. Schedules shrink. Maintenance becomes minimal. Eventually, a decision is made. Service is suspended. The tracks often remain in place at first. Steel rusts. Weeds grow between ties. Crossings are paved over. The corridor fades from daily life without ever being formally erased. From the outside, this looks like decline. From inside the system, it looks like optimization. Maintaining rail is expensive. Every mile of track carries obligation. Inspections still matter. Liability still exists. When traffic no longer justifies that cost, consolidation follows. What disappears is not just transport. It is possibility. Once a rail line is abandoned, restoring it is extraordinarily difficult. Rights-of-way lapse, land fragments, development fills gaps. What was once a continuous corridor becomes a series of disconnected parcels. The system can stop using a line quickly. It cannot easily bring one back. This asymmetry matters. As rail networks shrink toward their most profitable cores, the geography sharpens. Main lines remain. Secondary routes vanish. The map becomes simpler and more consequential. Regions that retain rail access stay integrated. Regions that lose it adapt or drift. Adaptation sometimes works. Trucking fills gaps at higher cost. Industries shift toward lighter goods. Local economies reorient around services, tourism, or commuting. But bulk, low-margin production becomes harder to sustain without rail. This has national consequences. A country's rail map does not just show where trains run. It shows where heavy industry can still operate competitively. It shows which regions can move commodities efficiently and which cannot. It reveals where resilience remains broad and where it has narrowed. Decline does not happen evenly. Urban centers often retain service because density supports it. Export corridors survive because volume demands it. Interior regions lose lines because traffic thins below viability. Each decision is defensible on its own. Together, they reshape national space. Rail abandonment rarely sparks debate beyond local impact. It occurs incrementally, case by case, justified by utilization and cost. The cumulative effect is difficult to see because it unfolds slowly. Generations grow up with a reduced map. What once was connection becomes history. Absence becomes normal. The loss of optionality fades from memory. Yet the influence remains. The lines that persist carry more weight precisely because alternatives are gone. Remaining corridors handle greater volume, greater consequence, greater dependency. Rail's retreat does not erase its power, it concentrates it. What remains becomes more essential. What disappears leaves behind regions that must work harder to stay connected. This is how rail continues shaping outcomes even through withdrawal, not by expanding opportunity everywhere, but by fixing opportunity where steel still runs. The backbone may narrow, but where it holds firmly. Rail lines rarely appear in conversations about modern economies. They are treated as finished infrastructure, legacy systems, background utilities that did their important work long ago. Attention shifts to digital platforms, global shipping, and instant communication. Yet beneath all of that, steel still governs movement. The routes laid decades or centuries ago continue to decide where goods flow efficiently and where they do not. They influence where industries cluster, where investment concentrates, and where decline accelerates. These effects do not announce themselves. They show up in patterns, in which towns grow quietly and which struggle to replace lost employers, in which ports remain viable and which fade, in which regions can still move weight cheaply and which cannot. Rail does not cause these outcomes alone. It shapes the conditions under which they occur. Once those conditions are fixed, they persist. This is the defining characteristic of rail as an invisible backbone. It does not need to adapt quickly to remain powerful. It only needs to remain. The nations rail helped build did not emerge through spectacle or singular decisions. They formed through accumulated choices reinforced by infrastructure that refused to move. What began as responses to immediate problems hardened into structure. Structure became economy. Today's rail networks carry that history forward. They embody past priorities. They constrain future options. They remind us that some systems shape society not by changing rapidly, but by holding steady long enough for everything else to reorganize around them. Rail does not sleep. It waits. It carries weight, and in doing so, it continues to quietly build the world we live in. Subscribe to the invisible backbone. Long-form stories about the systems most people never think about until something stops working.